Hello creeps! Andy here, and today I wanted to talk about one of my favorite horror writers at the moment, and that of course is Darcy Coates. I have become quite obsessed with Darcy Coates over the past 10 months. I think I read her first book either in December of last year or January of this year, and I have not stopped buying them. Every third or fourth book, I crave another Darcy Coates and I go pick up another one. Let me show you what I'm talking about. This is what I mean. So what better way to ring in the holiday season, the October season, the only one that matters, with a video about Darcy Coates. So basically I just wanted to do a reading guide to Darcy Coates. You know, what to expect from her works, some common themes, characters, plots, settings, that kind of stuff, and then just go from there. I won't be giving any spoilers away in this video, so don't worry about that. But basically it's just a video to try to convince you to read Darcy Coates because I want you to feel the happiness that I feel when reading her books. Let me just put these up somewhere real quick and then we'll get started. Okay, so let's just start with an introduction. So Darcy Coates first began publishing her books independently online, and in, I believe, 2015, one of her stories started getting picked up and people started buying it, and she eventually got them published as novels to sell. So that is why if you get an older book from her, for example, this one, this is Craven Manor, and you open it, it says copyright 2017 and 2020. So I'm assuming that originally it was published online in 2017 and then it was republished by, I don't know if it's like an agency or whatever that published this book, or a printing company or whatever it is. So I believe that's why it has two publication dates. It's really cool to be able to see her growth throughout the stories as well. If you read her older works, they are sometimes, quite different from her newer stuff, and it's just so cool to be able to see her grow as a writer, and it's really inspirational. I mean, she has written so many books in what seems like a short span of time. Obviously, I don't know how long she had these before she published them, but it seems like she's a very prolific writer, and she has just blown me away time and time again with her writing. It's really inspirational for someone like me who, went to college to get a degree in creative writing, to see a female horror writer just really killing it. That was an unintentional pun, but I'll take it. Let me fix this. This is gonna bother me. Also, her stories, I would say, are more than just horror. And in fact, I'll read a quote from her in a second, but you definitely have things that are more action and adventure, like Parasite. Parasite is also more sci-fi as well. And then there are a lot of paranormal stuff. You also have stuff that's more romance-based, like Voices in the Snow is, and there's even a little bit of romance in The Haunting of Blackwood House as well, which we'll touch on in a second too. Some of them you think, okay, this is a story I've heard before a million times. For example, The Haunting of Blackwood House is a story about a girl who is buying a house. A house has been on the market for decades. Nobody wants it because it was owned by a serial killer. It's in her budget. She buys it thinking that it's fine, and lo and behold, it is haunted. And the story, continues from there. And so you go into it thinking, oh, this is just a typical haunted house story. But Darcy Coates has a way of taking those like traditional horror tropes and kind of turning them on their head to where they add enough to the genre or the subgenre, whatever it is she's writing in, that it feels new and fresh and original, even though maybe the basis of the story has been told before. And next up, you need to know, if you're going to buy a Darcy Coates book, they are unputdownable. I am by no means a fast reader. In fact, for reading as many years as I have, I am a very slow reader. And these books just suck you in and you cannot put them down. And I finished them. I finished every single one in like 1 or 2 days because I just can't put them down. And to me, that is just the epitome of a good story. When you get so sucked in, it's impressive. And that is why she's one of my favorite writers right now, because I know what I'm going to get when I pick up a Darcy Coates book. I know it's going to be entertaining. I know it's going to be fun. I know it's going to be well written. I know the story is going to be creepy in some capacity. And I know I'm just along for the ride and it's going to be great. And that's what I've gotten with every one of her stories. Of course, I've liked some books more than others because of preference in subgenres or, whatever it is. But they are all just so fun. And these are the books that I just bought this year. So I can't imagine how many I will have even next year. So now actually let's get into a little bit more deeper analysis of what these stories are actually about, not individually, but more generalized. First, let's talk about setting. There are a few places that are kind of typical of her to write about. One of them are forests. A lot of her stories, short stories and novels, take place in the forests, and she does definitely draw inspiration from forests in a lot of her work. But also there's another common theme, and that is big, giant, beautiful houses. But what's interesting about these are these houses aren't huge, giant, beautiful modern day mansions. Oftentimes they are run down, they're old, they don't have electricity, they have horrible pasts, or they're decrepit in some way. So it's an interesting way of kind of bringing this modern story in an older setting, and it's just such an interesting mixture of two worlds. She does this again, this isn't a mansion, but for example in From Below, when they go down to find a shipwreck, same concept. It's just like this modern day story told in this like very unique, odd environment. It adds so much atmosphere to the book. Of course there are other settings that take place, but I think most commonly the stories are very much so pushed by the character as well as the setting. So the settings play a huge role in all of her works. So typically it is the setting that is uncomfortable for the characters. In fact, I can't think of really any where the settings are a comfortable environment. And so that really is like a huge part. It almost becomes a piece of the story, a character in the story is the setting itself, which actually she might say in this quote now that I'm thinking about it. This was in an article in Publishers Weekly. I'll leave the article linked down below in case you guys want to read it. She says, "The building or house can grow into a personality of its own." Okay, yeah, that's definitely true. A looming presence that watches or perhaps adds to the protagonist's struggle. So yeah, it is kind of like its own character in the story. One thing that I also want to point out is a quote by her where she talks about the gore and the horror that's in her stories. She says, "I've always preferred books that build dread and leave me wearily watching the darkest corners of my room. When I write, any gore is a byproduct of the story and not the reason for it. I've always wanted to capture the feeling that you have when you're outdoors at night and someone starts to tell an eerie campfire story. A special kind of dread rises, the kind that's both addictive and consuming." I just thought that that was a really interesting quote. So we've talked about setting, kind of where they take place. She loves the woods and creepy old buildings. Now let's talk a little bit about characters. So her characters are oftentimes on the younger side, kind of like just getting the grips of life, whether it is moving out for the first time on their own or taking on bigger things on their own or working jobs. Oftentimes they're kind of like at the start, it seems, of life. She also has strong female characters, and they're more than just damsels in distresses. Although sometimes there is a companion to them in the novel, they aren't there to be saved by anyone. This kind of ties in with the theme too. Usually they're experiencing something that's devastating. Typically it is some sort of loss, which isn't highlighted in the book, but it's just kind of a part of their story that's mentioned. And oftentimes their companions might save them, but they might turn around and save their companions as well. It is much more balanced. I love her strong female characters, regardless of whether they're coming to terms with their past or taking on something seemingly bigger than themselves. They are usually very strong, resilient, independent women, and I really do enjoy reading those characters. Now let's talk about the hunks really quick, because I haven't read a lot of her books where there are companions. A lot of the times the main characters are, like I said, independent on their own, doing their own thing. But for example, Voices in the Snow, and actually even The Haunting of Blackwood House, the female characters do have a companion, and it's interesting how similar their companions are. So the men in these books are like huge, larger than life, giant, tall, huge muscles, but they're so emotionally mature and kind. Maybe she just tries to make them more balanced, like physically strong, but emotionally vulnerable. I don't really know, but it is interesting to, see similarities in multiple characters that are the support to the lead character. She also says something about lead characters in this article as well. She says, "There's a bit of magic in writing early 20s characters," meaning characters in their early 20s. "It's a point of change in life. You're trying to plan for the future, live your own life for the first time, and establish friendships you've had as an adult. It's full of awkwardness and self-doubt and fear. And what better time than to put that person in an impossible situation, such as a house with a sinister story, or to tell them that their best friend has gone missing hiking in a remote forest." Again, I just think that that's interesting that she kind of has, the same similar age of characters. They usually tend to be female. In fact, out of all of these, I think Craven Manor is the only one that has the main character be a male, and Parasite kind of switches back and forth between female and male. But all the rest of them, the main character is a female. Next, let's move on to plot and theme. Oftentimes, loss is huge in these stories, and it can be physically lost, the person or a person being physically lost in a forest in their life, but it can also be a loss as in grief. Oftentimes these people have lost someone close to them, or they're struggling with their past, or they're struggling with a loss of some kind, and it's that loss and the setting and everything that helps them develop that full character arc and kind of face their past. External and internal struggles that lead to that character arc. And then she also wrote something about themes. Oh, she says, one thread that comes up repeatedly in my books is finding home. Whether home is a physical location to feel safe at, or a family or friends who are as good as family, most of my books have a character who is searching for something and conclude with them finding it, though often not in the form that they expected. And then let's go to endings really quick. So for me, I think that her endings typically lean on the happier side, and not in the sense that every character gets what they want, every character survives, nothing horrible happens, but horror is typically placement displacement, and oftentimes at the end we're feeling upset because something horrible happened throughout, though we may feel that it's finished or wrapped up in a way. Horror makes you feel a certain way at the end, and Darcy Coates has an interesting way of kind of wrapping things up neatly. Again, not to say that everything's perfect at the end, but I would say much happier than a typical horror book ending. And so for me, if you told me, oh yeah, these stories end, typically better than most horror stories, I'd be like, I don't know. But it really does give you a piece of solace that you don't really get when you're reading a book that's, just like a hardcore horror book. Like, think about the ending of Pet Sematary or something. It's a fantastic ending. I would not have had it any other way, but you feel a certain way finishing the story versus if you were to finish the story and everybody kind of got what they wanted in one way or another, or the story ended more wrapped up than it typically would in a horror story. I hope that makes sense, but I'm not giving anything away because I promise you horrible things happen in all of these books, and they don't always end perfectly and peacefully, but sometimes they do, and sometimes you're just in the mood for that. Sometimes you just want a story that's good, that's creepy, that's dark, that has some horror and blood and guts in there, but then also that kind of like wraps up at the end and makes you feel good. And a lot of horror stories don't do that, and Darcy Coates has a great way of making you feel dread and making you feel great at the end, and it's just like a delicate balance that she has mastered. She also says about her own endings, a lot of horror features flawed characters essentially being punished for their past sins. The story serves to call them to task for their flaws and ultimately mete out punishment, usually death. While these stories can be very satisfying, they're not what I'm most drawn to. I like to read stories about characters who end up in a bad situation, not necessarily through their own fault, and have to find a way to survive it. It's their test. They must rise to it. And they must be smarter and more resourceful than they ever imagined that they could be. But as long as they keep fighting, as long as they always strive to make the best choices in their power, I believe they deserve to come out the other side. It's valuable, I think, not just for the characters, but also for the readers and even myself. That ending is a palate cleanser, a reward for the stress we feel while reading and writing the book. And I just love that. I really do. It's much different, like I said, than most horror books that you read. And there's obviously a place for all horror, and there's absolutely a place for this. Don't go into it saying like, oh, well, Anda said every book is going to be fine and my character is going to survive, because there have been favorites of mine that have gotten knocked off. She also has a lot of haunting type books, which I'm not that well versed in. It seems like she kind of started with haunting and has moved away from that into other things, although The Haunting of Leigh Harker, I think, was released last year. And then one last thing that I want to say about her books is they are very character driven. So although the setting is important, although the plot's important, although there are common themes throughout, they are really character driven, and I think that's why I like reading them too, is I fall in love with the characters. I want them to succeed. I want them to have their character arc. I want them to overcome their past or those external struggles that they're experiencing. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but I do feel for them and I do like the characters that I'm reading. So real quick, I'm just going to give you a list of maybe my top 3. Let's start with my favorite. My favorite book is Still From Below. This book blew me away. It's a story about people scuba diving down to the depths of a sunken ship that nobody else has found before, and you go back and forth between present day of them diving and then also what happened to the ship to make it sink. Her descriptions of claustrophobia in this book and fear of the black depths of the ocean, it is surreal. I mean, I felt like I was there with them. I've never read a book like this before. For weeks afterward, I'm not just talking a day or two, weeks, I was having dreams that I was stuck on a ship. It was crazy how much this book just leaked into my subconscious. This book blew me away. I loved every second of it. Still my favorite Darcy Coates book. And then my other two favorites, I don't know which one I like more, but I really did like Hunted. This is a story about a girl that goes missing in the forest and her brother and friends go in after her to try to find her. I talked about these two in my last video, so I apologize for the repeated information, but for those of you who didn't watch it, this one is definitely, I would say, the most gory, I think, of the books that I've read of hers. There is a lot more in here that surprised me. There was some stuff that I figured out beforehand, but there were some twists and turns in here that I wasn't expecting. And I think for those reasons, this one is in my top 3 as well. This guy right here will always have a special place in my heart because this is the first Darcy Coates book that I read. It's not a story I would typically like. It's a little bit more on like the sci-fi, weird monstery type of side of things, which I don't typically read, but this book blew me away. I loved it. It's also very heavy on the romance, which I really didn't think that I liked until I read this book. Even though the plot isn't typically what I think I would like in it, I could not put this down. So there you have it. I really hope that this video helped you find a Darcy Coates book to pick up or just inspired you to grab one of her books if you haven't before. If you have read her and you love her stories, please leave a comment down below and let me know which one is your favorite. I'm reading The Haunting of Leigh Parker right now and I'm really enjoying it. So actually I'm gonna get back to reading that right now. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon for another horror video. Bye guys!